of preventing radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism. Minister, Mr. Koenders, on behalf of the Presidency in office, you have the floor.
President, Mr. Commissioner, honourable members, I think we all felt the same sorrow and outrage when we learned about the attack on the nightclub in Orlando, or the killing of a police chief and his wife in their home in Paris. Once more, innocent people have become victims of an act of terrorism in a place no one expected. Of course, we have seen this kind of horrendous violence before in our European cities, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Tunisia, in the United States, the Middle East, and all over the world. And it's a most distressing fact that these attacks are aimed at innocent civilians while they were having a drink in their neighborhood bar, ready to go on a well-deserved holiday, buying their daily groceries when they were at home with their family. The attack against a nightclub gathering homosexuals was the last shocking event that took place in the United States. Another worrying fact is that most of these atrocities were executed by citizens who grew up in our own cities, among ourselves, among our midst, sometimes in a process of self-radicalization. We are faced with individuals who turn their back on our societies and the universal values on freedom, equality and free speech. It's no use talking only about foreign terrorist fighters. Foreign is now also in our own society. And if we truly want to stop terrorism in its tracks, we need to show persons on the brink of radicalization that their society, our society, offers better alternatives. So we are faced with a tremendous task to step up our efforts to prevent radicalization, to counter violent extremism, to stop hate speech and fight discrimination. Of course, we are fully committed to that cause. The European Union, its member states, we are engaged in a balancing act between repression and prevention, and to ensure that we understand really what's going on. The heads of state and governments already highlighted the importance of preventing radicalization and safeguarding our values in their statements of February 2015. Since then, the European Union has not been sitting on its hands. How could we? We are currently implementing a range of measures to prevent radicalization, with a specific focus on detecting and removing internet content promoting terrorism, for instance. Let me give you a number of examples. The Europol Internet Referral Unit works together with internet companies to remove terrorist material from the internet. Very important. Second, the European Union Internet Forum facilitates a dialogue with the private sector to combat illegal online hate speech. I think we can't do without this cooperation of all actors, including the private sector. Thirdly, we work on the development of communication strategies to promote tolerance, non-discrimination, fundamental freedoms and solidarity throughout the Union. Then we have the Radicalization Awareness Network, supporting member states with expertise and helping them to develop prevention programs. We have the Syria Strategic Communication Advisory Team, which is helping, assisting, working with member states to develop counter-narratives against Daesh. And another example that the EU is working on is rehabilitation for foreign fighter returnees and prevention of radicalization in prisons. A ministerial conference took place in October 2015 and is now being followed up with the support of funding from the Commission. Next to countering the hateful narratives of extremists, our efforts on prevention are also directed at strengthening the resilience of our communities. Maybe that's even the most important. That requires a much more holistic but at the same time effective approach involving different policy areas and many different actors. Education on citizenship, universal values and mutual respect must start at an early stage. Our young people are the ones most vulnerable and the ones who need to stay on board. And it is our responsibility to give them the civic, social and cultural competence they need in our societies. This was also underlined in the joint declaration of the EU Ministers for the Education and yourself, Mr. Commissioner. Very important, building on this declaration, the Council adopted conclusions on developing media literacy and critical thinking and the role of youth policy in the fight against radicalization. Following the first Fundamental Rights Colloquium last year, the Commission has appointed coordinators on anti-Islam hatred, on anti-Semitism, and on tolerance who engage with all the relevant stakeholders. An advisor on religious freedom has also been appointed. Also, this is important in the context of promoting intra- and interfaith dialogue. Honourable members, terrorism is in nature global and it doesn't stop at the EU borders. In complementarity with the work we're doing within the European Union, there is, of course, a continuous need to work together with our international partners to combat and prevent radicalism and terrorism. To give you also there a few examples of our activities. In the Middle East and North Africa, the European Union is supporting several projects on prevention of radicalization, countering terrorism financing and working on judicial capacity. The European Union has developed under Slovenian lead the so-called Western Balkans Counter-Terrorism Initiative, and we also work with the Radicalization Awareness Network in third countries like Tunisia, like Turkey, with first-line practitioners to prevent radicalization. Also, the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum is an excellent example of a multilateral effort of countries around the world coming together and joining their efforts to combat and prevent terrorism in a very concrete plan of action. We have expanded the network of our security and CT experts in the European Union delegations to work in the field and with civil society on preventing radicalization and countering threats of terrorism. So, ladies and gentlemen, to summarize, combating and preventing terrorism is at the top of the European agenda. We are and we will remain fully committed to prevent radicalization, counter violent extremism, stop hate speech and fight discrimination. I know there is a very strong will also among you and in this Parliament to make progress on de-radicalization and countering violent extremism measures. We welcome in particular your resolution of November 2015 as an important contribution. We share this determination and we look forward to working with you in order to advance as quickly as we can. Thank you for your attention, Madam President.
Thank you, Minister. Now, Commissioner Navracsics.
Minister, honourable members, the recent and horrendous attacks in Europe remind us that terrorism is global and yet extremely local, as the majority of recent perpetrators have been our own citizens. Born and raised on our territories, educated in our schools, now radicalized and inspired by an ideology of destruction, giving in to propaganda of hate and turning against their own fellow citizens and our common values. The fact that these Europeans were radicalized into violent extremism on our soil says something about the social fabric of our societies and the need to strengthen its resilience. Our response needs to be holistic. This is the approach you expressed in the reports prepared by your colleagues, Julie Ward and Rashida Dati, and we have taken in our most recent communication on supporting the prevention of radicalization leading to violent extremism. It is part of our larger Commission effort to implement the European Agenda on Security, and it builds on existing capabilities and efforts. We have put forward an ambitious set of initiatives ranging from research and evidence building to countering terrorist propaganda and hate speech online, addressing prison radicalization, promoting inclusive education, and reaching out to young people in general. And since violent extremism has no borders and several third countries face very similar challenges, we also foresaw measures to support third countries in their endeavour. We have several operational as well as security tools at hand. While prevention has to be our first priority, our security approach needs to be reinforced at the same time. We need to enhance our capability to disrupt terrorist activity, stem the flow of finance, prevent access to weapons, and disrupt terrorist travel. Those returning to Europe from conflict areas are a particular concern. That is why we will propose a review of the Schengen Information System and why we have proposed systematic checks at the external borders for everyone entering and exiting the EU, whether they are EU or non-EU citizens. Then there is the Internet, which certainly appears to be accelerating the radicalization process, and where our young people are exposed to the poisonous and barbaric rhetoric of violent extremists. Recent investigations also demonstrate how the Internet is playing a more prominent role in attacks themselves. This is precisely why we launched the EU Internet Forum in December 2015. We brought together ministers, Europol and high-level representatives of major Internet companies. We agreed on two key objectives: that we must reduce accessibility to terrorist content online, and that we must empower civil society partners to increase the volume of positive alternative narratives online. In addressing the first objective, an Internet referral unit has been established at Europol. In addition to providing substantive operational support to Member States, in just under a year, it has referred over 8,000 pieces of terrorist content to the companies. In the vast majority of cases, the material has been swiftly removed. We are now taking this one step further through a joint referral mechanism, which is being developed by the Internet companies to improve the speed and volume of referrals and prevent removed material from being re-uploaded as well. In addressing the second objective, namely to create positive alternative narratives to that of the violent and divisive terrorist narrative, we have committed €10 million to help equip civil society partners with the technical skills and training that they require to ensure their voices are seen and heard online. Those efforts start primarily at the local level. Police officers, youth counsellors, prison and probation staff and teachers are the practitioners best placed to identify the early warning signs of radicalization. But they are also brought together at the European level through the Radicalization Awareness Network Centre of Excellence. Through this network of networks, more than 2,400 local practitioners from all over Europe are working together. We committed a budget of €25 million for the next 4 years to help the network fulfill its mission, while under our internal security funds, over €314 million is available for anti-radicalization projects for the period 2014-2020. Honourable members, let me now turn to another key pillar of prevention: education. Education, both inside and outside the classroom, and youth activities in general, are crucial for this comprehensive approach. Education plays a vital role in the socialization of children, in developing social and emotional skills. Fundamental values can be best internalized from an early age. We need solid foundations which help young people be resilient against extremist ideologies and violence and have a common sense of belonging. That is why, in cooperation with France, I called for an extraordinary meeting of the education ministers in Paris in March 2015, and we together adopted the Paris Declaration. On that basis, we proposed a series of concrete measures to reach out to teachers, educators, youth workers, and, most importantly, young people on the ground. We are working towards a comprehensive policy framework in the form of a Council recommendation to promote inclusion and fundamental values in education. It will offer policymakers and practitioners concrete policy guidance and facilitate mutual learning, building on research evidence on what works. We are mobilizing the Erasmus Plus program, where we make available this year €400 million for transnational cooperation projects. Projects aiming at inclusion and fundamental values will be given priority. In addition, with €13 million, we will upscale and disseminate successful grassroots initiatives. Horizon 2020 will also be further mobilized to support research into violent radicalization. Teachers and trainers are key, and we will step up our efforts to support them. E-twinning, the world's biggest teachers network, which is supported by the Erasmus Plus program, enables 300,000 teachers across the EU to run joint projects and link pupils from different countries and backgrounds. We will extend e-twinning further to selected neighbourhood countries so that pupils and classrooms can better know and understand each other from an early age. We will also set up a network to encourage direct contact between young people and positive role models, for instance, entrepreneurs, artists, sportspersons, and even formerly radicalized people. They will be selected at local level and invited to visit schools, youth clubs, sport clubs, and prisons to share their experiences. Finally, we will set up Erasmus Plus virtual exchanges between young people, both within and outside the EU. Our aim is to bring 200,000 of them together through structured and moderated online discussions by 2020 to raise empathy and promote intercultural dialogue. Honourable members, resilience against violent radicalization will come through a combination of these actions and partners. The Commission is determined to help and support in every way we can in order to find a holistic solution to this urgent challenge we are all faced with. Together with all my fellow commissioners, I stand ready to work with you in the European Parliament, with Member States and civil society to implement these measures. I trust that I can count on your support. Thank you very much.
Köszönöm biztos úrnak a nyitó gondolatait, most pedig a képviselő.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now, on behalf of the political groups, Mrs. Hohlmeier for the EPP, 3 minutes.
Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, Minister, Commissioner, colleagues, first of all, I would like to express my thanks for the possibility to hold the debate today, because the issue of radicalisation and de-radicalisation is one of the cornerstones if we're to fight against terrorism that's currently besetting the EU. If we want to reduce it or completely combat it. We can see with the current attacks that we're facing new forms of radicalisation alongside the older, more familiar forms of radicalisation. And I think we need to give greater attention to it. I'm thinking, for example, of areas that aren't often discussed, for example, prisons, and the member states need to enact serious measures to prevent radicalisation in prisons, so that those people who start with petty crime don't end up as on recruiting and terrorism at the level of the EU. Secondly, we've seen in recent attacks that we're dealing with new forms of self-radicalisation. That means people who use the internet and are given instructions via the internet about how to commit serious crimes. There's a whole propaganda machinery which we have to tackle and put an end to. And we need to have penalties and sanctions for those people placing this propaganda on the internet, as well as offering help to people who have entered these networks. But this also needs to be brought down from the internet. Some of these people are offered the prospect of becoming heroes. They're easy targets. We must put an end to this. So there are new platforms But the internet can also be used to positive ends. In other words, we need to develop a counter strategy against this kind of propaganda propagation as pursued by IS and others. We've had good measures, for example, the Internet Referral Unit or the EU Internet Forum, and cooperation with private enterprises is very important here. Furthermore, we shouldn't overlook the fact that IS and other terrorist organizations are trying to break into the social media to attract those young people who feel marginalized. We have to ensure that member states have countermeasures, for example, setting up and supporting social organizations to help these young people.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Gomes, 2.5 minutes.
In November, the Parliament approved a report on this subject with specific measures within it on cooperation, collaborations, exchange of information between security and intelligence services, and in that report it said just how important it was to take measures to prevent radicalisation in prisons and so on across Europe. Now, despite this, we still have this European PNR, which is being presented as a silver bullet against terrorism, which is still problematic in the field of charter flights and private flights. There are also security measures that don't really give us any kind of genuine security. That's without even talking about the funding of terrorism. We're paying the price of a lack of Europe in this field, a lack of coordination and joint action in our external policy and security on an internal basis. There's conflicts such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, the Ukraine and others in our neighbourhood that are aggravating the situation. Our security depends on the ideological battle being waged outside of our borders, but however we cannot allow the right-wing insurgency within our borders as well, people speaking out against refugees and immigrants, increasing talk of foreign fighters in inverted commas, where these are actually European citizens, people who have been brought up in Europe and radicalised within our prisons and our societies. They are being used as a justification to attack other peoples, invoking the name of Daesh. We have made mistakes in Council and Commission, and here we have to acknowledge that neoliberal policies have failed. They've boosted poverty, they've created ghettos, exclusion, more exclusion and social injustice. They've created the conditions for Islamic State to prosper, as well as neo-Nazis and fascists to recruit our young people and turn them into murderers. Austerity policies have limited our abilities to coordinate security and defence. They've also stopped us being able to refurbish and rehabilitate our prisons and stopping them becoming hotbeds of terrorism. This is all tying our hands in the field of preventing radicalism. And now the Commission comes forward and says we need to prevent radicalisation. Okay, but we also need intelligent policies that will actually achieve this in schools, in clubs, in organisations, in non-governmental organisations, in the private sector. And we need to focus on work done in communities, in families, in religious communities, the Muslims across Europe that are suffering doubly because of the devastating effect of this kind of atrocity. We have to focus on actions which are not just short-term, such as taking away nationality from people who are suspected of terrorism. We need to think as well. The speaker's cut off.
Köszönöm az ön gondolatait, most pedig rátérünk a következő hozzászólásra. Stevens képviselő asszony.
Thank you. And now Mrs. Stevens, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, radicalisation is a cross-border phenomenon. We see that across the 28 EU member states. There are 16,000 radicalised Muslims. The causes are not just to do with being left behind in society. There are many reasons, returning away from the West or trying to do something significant. Some resort to violence or attacks having returned from conflict zones. And this is to do with a critical situation here. We, however, have to act against this phenomenon. And when I say we, I mean all those of goodwill. and that means Muslims too. We need to work for gender equality, gay rights and other rights. Fighting terrorism isn't just about policing. Radicalization prevention networks can represent European added value. And of course, we have to work socially with such people all the time. Prison staff, social services staff and so on can be part of such a network. They have the necessary information, and of course the security services need to identify early suspicious situations can be reported at an early stage. Women who don't want to shake hands, or if children are forced to study the Quran or participate in Ramadan. Fighting terrorism is a job for us all. Thank you very much. Now, Paga Daur Otundwa Ruiz, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commission and Representative of Council. I looked at the selfie that was taken by the Orlando killer, and I think it's absolutely essential to look at this and remember what's happening on the internet and how it's happening. Ending terrorism means minimizing the threat and the capacity of terrorism. If we're going to overcome terrorism and the different forms of violent fanaticism of our times, we have to work on police intelligence and judicial activity, but we also need to be able to provide an effective questioning of the policies that are leading us to human suffering. And in a longer term, we have to break down hatred, dehumanization and the legitimization of cruelty. Furthermore, the ideology behind the recruitment of fanatics generates another form of hate, and so it's going to be essential to fight against these forms of hatred, and it's not easy. Young people need ideas which will prevent this legitimization of violence against others. They need to avoid falling into the temptation of hating other groups of human beings, whether they be real groups or invented. And we need to prevent seeing other people as enemies. In this globalized world, ICT has changed our perception of reality, and new generations particularly need to develop their own consistent vision of what dignity and humanity is for each individual. And that's why we welcome the new measures taken by the Commission. The EU strategy in 2005 had become obsolete, and the situation we face now is the same across the world. Experts say that violent radicalization is tied up with the public policies that are in place in a given country. Experts and local authorities and citizens are asking us to change from just empty words. If you look at people who want to ensure the moral disintegration of our society, we have to make sure these people are forced to obey our laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Spinelli. You have the floor. 1.5 minutes.
Grazie. Thank you. In France, as in North America, we're facing a change in the form of terrorism and radicalization. Quite often ISIS takes responsibility, but the acts are homegrown. It is the citizens from those countries to decide that alone. The assassination of Jo Cox, who is something that we now had to face. She defended her ideas. Political participation is deemed dead, and violence is trivialized. The assassin of Magnanville said he wanted recognition. Now we need to think about why this is happening without focusing on individual triggers. The internet, prisons, schools, and what's even worse is to respond with greater surveillance, our democracy, with greater Islamophobia, with proxy wars that are targeting individual groups. The murder of Jo Cox reminds us of the assassination of a emperor in the Middle Ages. It doesn't come out of nowhere. If we reply to terrorism with fear of conflicts, then terrorism will win the day. Thank you.
Köszönöm. Most pedig Lunacek képviselő asszony.
Thank you. Mrs. Lunacek is the next speaker for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. Once again, as at the beginning of this sitting, I would like to express my shock and sadness at the attacks in Orlando a little over a week ago, where 49 people were brutally slaughtered and at least as many were injured, and hundreds of family and friends were left mourning, unable to understand what had happened. And also Jo Cox, who before she was an MP worked here in this Parliament. She was one of us, and who was also brutally slaughtered, and also the policeman and wife in France, the people we pay tribute to at the beginning of this sitting. How can people nurture such hatred which leads them to knife or shoot people who have different values, diversity, equal rights for migrants wherever they come from, whatever their skin colour or sexuality, people who are enjoying their lives, like in Orlando in the gay nightclub? That was an attack against gay people. Is this an attack that we can prevent? People who are radicalised and then become violent extremists. Well, we need education, employment, inclusion to fight that, because often these are the root causes. They are people with no meaning in their lives, no job, no hope, no future. People who feel that there's nothing they can do in their lives. So we need to deal with that. And the second point, which has been mentioned, youth centre work, school work, prison work, where often young people who are in for petty offences become radicalised and prepared to be violent. Two examples I'd like to mention which demonstrate just this. The European Citizens Prize for 2015 gave the Social Cohesion Network of Austria the prize. People going into prisons, working successfully as prison visitors, helping young people and older people move away from radicalism. And another very topical example, yesterday in Molenbeek there was a meeting here in Brussels between a martial arts centre from Vienna with martial arts champions and the people of Molenbeek. They were invited to come and show what they can do in the centre. Martial arts often are a channel for young people to release their tensions. These are positive examples, and if people work together, we can see that these things are not necessarily written in the Quran, and there are different ways through sport of dealing with these things. Thank you.
Képviselő asszony következik 2 percben.
Now Mrs. Winberg, 2 minutes.
Tack, fru talman.
Thank you very much, Madam President. How can we prevent radicalisation? Yes, that's an extremely important and topical issue, but perhaps what would be even better would be to discuss why the problem has come about in the first place. And I'll direct some harsh criticism to the Commission. During 2014 and 2015, they allowed millions of migrants into the EU without having any kind of control over who got onto European soil. It's no secret that many jihadists came over on refugee boats, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that. There are already thousands of jihadists in the EU today. There may even be more than we're aware of. We've heard that there are some sleeper cells that are beginning to mobilize here and there. And I think so many of these scum that are coming onto European soil are creating so many problems for our member states. There are lots of people as well who are leaving Europe to fight for Islam. About 20 were caught on their way to Syria just last week, and now we're being told that we have to open up our borders again. Well, I think it's good to have a European directive focusing specifically on stopping terrorism instead of stupid proposals being disseminated to prohibit the possession of weapons for hunters and shooters, sport shooters. And I would propose 3 steps. Firstly, checking and controlling our borders. Secondly, harsh penalties for those who have planned or carried out terrorist attacks. And 3, removing citizenship for those who are travelling for the purposes of terrorism. I think that instead of just plumping up more money for this problem, the question of radicalisation has to be dealt with at its source.
Thank you very much. Mr. Briois, 1.5 minutes.
Oui, Charlie
Hebdo, the Bataclan, Brussels, Orlando, now Magnolville. The list of attacks perpetrated by the IS is getting longer. If the people of Europe are right to pay homage to the victims, what about politicians? They need to act. However, up to now, any actions against Islamic terrorism certainly haven't shone. On the contrary, despite the high level of alert, it's still possible to take a plane to Brussels without being checked. That happened to me last week. The same happens with the border controls that are still not in place. These jihadist terrorists can circulate and move about freely in this wonderful Europe. But if we want to put an end to this threat, first of all, we have to be bold enough to name it. And today, you put on the agenda a debate called Prevention of Radicalisation Leading to Terrorism and Extremism. That's basically putting your head in the sand because you are purposely not using the word Islamism. That shows just how naive you are, but also how afraid and weak, because our model of civilization is not up for negotiation. We have to turn away from lax approach and enact strong, firm measures. First of all, put an immediate end to Schengen, shore up the security staff, and finally take away the nationality of anyone praising terrorism who has dual nationality. Now, all we expect from the European Commission is to leave the Member States in peace, leave them to do their job.
A független képviselők közül Epitideiosz képviselő úrnak adok szót.
Thank you, Chair. One of the most serious problems in our societies, we're suffering from it, is the radicalization of our young people. They want to overthrow the existing order and they think that will solve their problems. But to sort out this issue, we're not acting in the right way. Instead of educating our youth, teaching them their history, their religion, their civilization, their principles, the principles of our countries, we've accepted rampant poverty and the destruction of the middle classes. We're reverting to the situation 60 years ago when education was a privilege for the rich. The harsh austerity in many countries, in particular in Greece, means that the young people have to drop out of school and try to find in a maelstrom of unemployment any job in order to survive. This means that they are isolated, marginalized, they hate the society, they are unhappy, they hate the society that has taken away any hope for their future. So they're an easy target for extremist propaganda, and in particular of Islamist fanaticism and terrorism. Some countries do not respect basic rules of democracy. They believe that through hate speech.
Thank
you. You had 1 minute available to you. Now, I'm very sorry, but time was running out. Now, Mrs. Metsola for 2 minutes.
Grazie. Allow me to add my voice in tribute to Jo Cox, a tough mother of 2 who got into politics to make a difference for all the right reasons and who was so brutally killed while doing her duty. I know all of us here would want to ensure her legacy in fighting hate is preserved. We must do what we can to find the right balance between allowing our freedoms and ensuring citizens' safety. One of the hardest lessons learned from the attacks in Europe was that our information sharing capabilities are still not being fully utilised. Europe cannot afford to play catch-up. Radicalisation, whether online or on land, is one of the toughest challenges our enforcement agencies face. We need Europol to have the resources it needs, and we need to come down harder on those who preach hate and use religion as a disguise for their message of evil. It is not only law enforcement. We also need a new approach to integration in our societies, where we see this as a two-way process of respect for people's rights, but also respect for European values. Work to overcome obstacles to revoking passports of so-called foreign fighters, particularly dual nationals who travel to conflict zones before coming back to Europe to radicalise and recruit, must continue. They do not deserve any protection an EU passport may give them. If the horrific attack in Orlando showed anything, it is that terrorism knows no borders, no nations. It is a global struggle that requires a global partnership for its defeat. Notwithstanding the horror of the crime in Florida, the worst of times brought out the best in people, who stood up, scared but undeterred, and shouted that while today we mourn, in the end, love always wins over hate. And those voices echoed around the world. It is this that will be the lasting tribute to the victims of terror everywhere. Terrorism may well still cast its shadow on our lives. It will not, however, define us. It is the determination to continue to live our lives as we see fit, despite the apprehension, that will show the true character of Europe. Thank you.
Köszönöm, most pedig Fajon képviselő asszony.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mrs. Fajon, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, dear colleagues. Last week, Jo Cox died because of the beliefs and principles she believed in. She believed that diversity can unite us. She believed in values that would bring peace and harmony to humankind if everybody believed in them. Radicals are ready to die for the ideas they believe in, but their ideas are the opposite of fundamental human rights and European values, as they are based on favoring some people and values at the expense of others. The EU now, with all the terrorist threats and attacks, is now dealing with the radicalization of people, especially young people joining Islamic radicals and their ideas. And yes, we certainly need European cooperation and information exchange, especially among judicial and police authorities, so as to fight the dangers of radicalism and terrorism. But you well know that radicalization is possible in many different areas. Now, during the crisis, many groups can radicalize at the same time, in parallel. So here we can sometimes see this in the approach to some groups, such as LGBTI groups, immigrants, refugees, some religious groups, the Roma people, disabled people, and others. To prevent radicalization, we should focus especially on, first, addressing the causes and social economic circumstances, and second, dialogue with citizens and combating hate speech, especially on the internet. The Socialists and Democrats have emphasized this many times, and we do so today as well. Writing and sharing information on the internet has turned into a new European freedom, so it seems, but all this is completely unregulated. But member states need measures to limit and penalize hate speech and intolerance, because all these are cancers to our society. This is why we must call on member states and the Council to stop blocking directives on the fight against discrimination. So, unfortunately, here too, we are not united, and this is unacceptable. In any case, tomorrow's referendum results, whatever they are, will be a very good lesson for us to see where these disoriented EU policies are taking us. Thank you.
Képviselő asszony tökéletesen használta ki az idejét. Nicholson képviselő úrnak adok szót 1 percben. Tessék.
Thank you very much for having kept to the...
No, Jo Cox, but I want to say how grateful I am that the President today took the opportunity to pass sympathy. As I come from Northern Ireland, I went through 40 years of this type of terrorism, and I know today we have a husband left without a wife and 2 children without a mother. I don't think any words can actually say how terrible that is. It eats into the family. I feel that every time we meet in this Parliament to debate this topic, atrocities have happened in the intervening period, and they've all been referred to, be it Orlando, be it in this city, be it in Paris or wherever. And quite clearly the terrorists involved in the terrorist attacks in those cities is that terrorism, the so-called Islamic State, is not simply a foreign policy problem. It's often a homegrown problem and often troubling young individuals radicalised in the countries that they mercilessly attack. We need to strengthen the preventative strategies in our prisons, as well as engaging civil society, religious leaders and communities and local communities. Radicalisation towards any terrorist group or violent activity, regardless of religion or ideology, is not acceptable. Thank you.
Én is köszönöm. Következő hozzászóló.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Ježek, 1.5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. Well, since I have been shadowing the directive on combating terrorism and gathered more and more information, I'm afraid the terrorist threat is even more worrying than I thought before. Also, the recent terrorist attacks showed how easy it can be to conduct them, and to become radicalised is even easier, regardless of the nature of the radicalism. And there are numerous types of terrorism and radicalisation. Especially religiously inspired terrorists have continued to demonstrate their intent and capacity to conduct violent acts. The terrorist threat from those groups is increasingly acute. There were around 5,000 Europeans fighting alongside ISIS, and 30% of them have returned to their countries of departure after having gained combat experience. This poses a risk in the sense that they may have the intention to carry out terrorist attacks, but also because of the possibility that they will initiate or engage in recruitment cells. We need to be prepared for this, and in order to adopt efficient measures we must be aware of the magnitude of the problem. To prevent radicalisation leading to violent extremism is an enormous task, particularly when it comes to effective action. The Commission made a step in the right direction, and prevention deserves broad support. Rather than anything else, the threat should unite us in response. Thank you.
Most pedig Kósó Pármúj képviselő úr következik 1 perc.
Now, Kosovo, 1 minute. Thank you very much. Combining Islamist radicalisation and hate against the Muslim community is explosive. Now, we've seen what happens in history, destabilisation of the zone for geopolitical reasons to control oil, that some of our allies, or even ourselves, we use the divide and rule. And then there's our allies, such as Saudi Arabia, that has systematic dissemination of radical Islam, leading to, for example, Al-Qaeda. We've seen thousands and millions spent in arms exportation from the EU. We could instead have negotiated peace solutions within the UN and also non-interference. We also need to fight against poverty and social exclusion in our neighbourhoods, where we have ghettos and the Wahhabis, for example, find a good breeding ground.
Köszönöm. Képviselőtársaim, tudom, hogy szigorúan be szeretném tartatni.
Thank you. Can I ask colleagues to stick to time? I know it's difficult, but it's not going to work if you speak too quickly. Otherwise, it's very difficult to provide interpretation. So please, could you speak more slowly? Mrs. von STORCH, for 1 minute.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. Today we are hearing a statement from the Commission on prevention of radicalisation and terrorism. However, measures need to be undertaken on the spot where people are living in Brussels, Munich or London. They don't live in the EU. We've seen in Brussels that there are parallel societies which are forming hotbeds and hideaways for terrorists because they are shut away, and Sharia law counts more for them, the majority, than other laws. The AFD has made these claims. Foreign financing must be banned for mosques. Imams have to be trained in our countries, Salafist preachers should not be funded by Saudi petrodollars. All Islamic associations have clearly to distance themselves from the relevant parts of Sharia, which is against our law. Anti-constitutional associations should be forbidden from building and operating mosques. Erdogan has said that the mosques are his barracks and the believers are his soldiers. We need to shut down these barracks and de-arm his soldiers.
The next speaker is Mr. de GRAAFF. 1 minute.
Voorzitter, de EU is de ene.
Thank you, Madam President. The European Union is the second largest donor to the Palestinian Authority, and they are in many cases Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites, yet we find money to give to these people, and we see the bloody results, and Palestinian radicalization is even being encouraged with hatred of the Jewish community included. This is really a culture of welcome to such people in the European Union that prevails. Whilst people are building arsenals of weapons to increase these attacks, we have to stop Islamization and stop money being sent to these people, particularly outside of our borders.
Thank you. Can I ask for the technicians' help, because it seems that there's a problem with the French booth? Could I ask the technicians to have a look, please? The next speaker, Mrs. VOZEMBERG, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The issue at stake today, once more, has to do with the repeated terrorist attacks taking place in Europe and all over the world. The latest research in Europe shows that there is a dramatic increase in the criminality of young people. Why is that? Because they're desperate people, marginalized. There's no hope for them. And this is why, and this is due to certain policies that have been introduced these last years. If people have no job, no prospects, they consider that it is good to spread hatred and panic, and they think that the criminals are heroes. Why are the young people radicalized? First of all, in prisons, where there is no education, and then we have the internet. There's no control on the internet. The controls are insufficient anyway, and it is easy for these people to find instructions, to find hate messages, and to turn against society. The answer to those who want to kill their fellow citizens, to those who are full of anger and hatred, is more solidarity, more humanity. We must all decide that we have our responsibility and our role. We should change our narrative in this room. There are no innocent victims. All the victims of terrorism are innocent. So this effort to separate the victims in two categories could lead to wrong logics which help terrorists. The answer is love and more Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Mrs. Piri for 2.5 minutes.
Működik? Igen. Köszönöm. Niemand wordt op een dag wakker als radicale salafist die zijn huis en...
Thank you. No one is going to leave their home and their family to travel to Syria to become radicalized without a reason. There's a context behind these situations. So if you look at the detail of the context, you have to look at what's happening locally in the neighborhoods, the parents, the imams, and people working with young people in the communities. people who feel discriminated against. These are people who turn towards terrorism. There are social and economic reasons for this, but it's more than that. There's also a religious extremism at work, and this is certainly a European problem, but not only European. It happens all around the world. The European Union has problems in Molenbeek and in the suburbs of Paris, but it's not just here. There are more than 4,000 foreign fighters coming from Europe. The recent terrorist attacks in Brussels show us that we have a serious problem on our hands, and one that all member states have to deal with. Radicalized young people are a common problem in our countries, and we have to establish a common response to tackling it. Our governments cannot sit around idly by while this problem is on the rise, and I think we have to ensure that our authorities are assuming responsibility for tackling the problem. The intelligence services have to cooperate properly. We have a lot of databases already in existence. If there's a danger that is flagged up in one country and that individual travels to another country, that has to be passed on, that information. Databases have to be interlinked in the right way so that radicalized young people and the preachers of hate can be tackled more effectively and not just escape detection by travelling from one country to another. Each country, of course, does need its own plan to combat radicalization, but without the right interlinking, this will simply be an illusory solution and will represent a continued threat to our security. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Mr. Hotz is the next speaker for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, in principle, we all have a national identity. We have a rich history, and every country has the right to protect it. We are at a dramatic juncture. We have many refugees. We have the challenge of terrorism. Many people have lost their lives. Many people suffer tremendously. But we have to realize that we cannot integrate with the refugees if on the other side, on the refugees side, there is no will to assimilate or integrate. This is all wishful thinking. Millions of refugees that have been accepted here, this is no solution. We have to help at the source of the problem. We have to build hospitals, schools, help in the countries from which the refugees are coming. Ordo Caritatis, this is the golden rule. We have to show misericordia and mercy to our family, to our community, and then to others.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Adjea, for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Whenever a tragic event occurs, Orlando, the killing of Joe Cox, MP, we end up here debating it, and perhaps in the Commission too. They're working on documents, they're working on fighting terrorism, and while we're trying to repair the effects of this extremely salient phenomenon, we forget that we need first to tackle and understand the root causes. I'd like to mention a few of them: poverty, social problems, marginalisation, lack of job prospects, cultural alienation, broken family ties. These are the causes that create fertile ground for radicalisation. Let's not forget that many of the new terrorists, the ones being trained now on social media, are people born and bred on our continent, people who have lived here. This is a social emergency we're tackling, which weighs heavy in Europe, not just on European citizens, but also people who've come to us that we've been unable to integrate or haven't wanted to integrate. Let's never forget the causes, because only by understanding the causes can we deal with the effects. Today it's important that we go on talking about it, resolving the problems of poverty. Only by eradicating poverty and dealing with the poor people, taking them under our wing, wherever they come from? Can we deal with radicalisation?
Monsieur Borghezio, pour 1 minute.
Many years ago, when we sounded the alarm for the danger of an unbridled immigration, of opening the doors to everyone, and enlargement of the whole of Europe, and then radical Islam that was political, that had nothing to do with the Quran, but had a lot to do with hatred against our civilization. Well, all we got was hauled before the courts, told that we were xenophobic and racist. But today, finally, we're hearing the Council and the Commission realizing there's a danger. Terrorism now is arriving in our houses. They're shooting policemen, even gay people. Now, when I hear what the Commission says, maybe we should be reassured. They're telling us that they're having a look at how to prevent terrorism. However, when you actually read what the anti-terrorism coordinator, Gilles de Kerchove, has said, he said that on the subject of foreign fighters, we need to be able to reintegrate them, because we can't lock them into prisons. We'll have to provide them a new alternative. We're mad. Now, in Europe, we're simply not thinking straight. We have to throw them out of Europe. Throw them out.
Merci, monsieur. Monsieur Voss.
Thank you. Mr. Voss, 2 minutes.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Madam President. In Paris, we've seen by chance that on the one hand, we're dealing with individual terrorists in one instance, and you say that these attacks with firearms are taking place. You indicated that the individuals are radicalized online or in prison. And it's also striking that we also have the homegrown terrorists, many times member state citizens. So I think that at these different levels we need to take appropriate steps. That's one thing. And another point that's often been mentioned in recent debates is quite naturally the fighting with the illegal smuggling of weapons. We need to do both, and you mentioned that as well, Commissioner. There's also the question of how online we can act with the social media and cooperate increasingly with the economy, and to find out how this radicalization can be countered. And thirdly, of course, we need a program for the prisons so that we can get to grips with the problems there better. We can't allow further radicalization to be taking place there. I think we need awareness work, outreach. You've also mentioned the work with the teaching staff at schools. They can play a key role and must. And something else that we need to think seriously about is a sort of a common place for family members and other authorities to come to. In recent discussions in Strasbourg, we've heard about the interoperability of databases, including biometric data, might help us to make a change to the Schengen border rules, and also quickly building a PNR system to also supervise Quranic schools and to monitor imams from abroad. Thank you. Mr. Weidenholzer, 2 minutes.
Vor 2 Wochen war ich im Sinjar-Gebirge im Nordirak, wo Monate.
Well, with the situation that we have in northern Iraq with the Yazidis, which have come, a horrific situation. We see a destroyed landscape there, foreign fighters that have been shot down. We see a system that has created a very serious situation indeed. And we also have a 33-year-old Austrian who had been transformed, who had been Islamicized and was fighting there. But the question is, what did this man do? Undoubtedly, voluntarily, he went there, or there must have been some sort of event in his life that led him to go to Iraq, or somehow he was recruited, or somehow he was somehow taken up by these particular forces, and he went there to fight. So this is not an individual case. This is a mass phenomena that we've seen, and what we have to do is answer questions. We have to answer questions as to why this individual ended there. It's a very complex problem, and there are numerous different reverberations that we have to deal with, and of course our patience is being tested. Of course, the initiative of the Commission is indeed welcome. I hope it doesn't remain something symbolic and that there's some sort of continuum thereafter. We need a sustainable solution to the problem of foreign fighters. And we have to really bring into all of this not only police and military intelligence, but also social services as well. We need instruments, implements in order to be able to carry out the various proposals of the Commission. We need some sort of observatory of the Internet as well. It's very important. But also, we also need to pay special attention to a problem which goes across borders throughout the world, and we ought not forget that the recruiting of foreign fighters has become very, very easy, particularly where living conditions are poor, where there's unemployment, where living conditions are unacceptable. These are fertile grounds for the recruitment of foreign fighters.
Madame, Theocharouis, pour 1 minute.
Mrs. Theocharouis, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. The radicalization of individuals is a challenge which requires broad action, involves security, and involves finding out what the roots of this problem is. As the European agenda for security has to take into consideration prevention of Islamic propaganda and spreading the word of hate. Education has to be on the forefront of this particular approach. The European Union, within its remit, has to support national efforts which are being made and provide added value in situ to the actions which have been adopted. So we have to be on the front line. Unfortunately, Turkey is not on the front line because Turkey itself is in the process of violating democracy. There are greenhouses, fertile ground, if you like, for the development of extremism in various radical mosques of Turkey. So it is absolutely necessary to have some sort of protection system in place. Thank you.
2 minutes.
Mr. Diaz de Mera, 2 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. A couple of initial comments. Solidarity and rejection. We show solidarity with the victims, our friend Joe Cox in the UK and the victims in Orlando. I reject any form of terror out of hand, and I welcome what the Commission said on the 14th of June regarding the prevention of radicalisation. We face a new complex challenge here. Unfortunately, the most recent terrorist attacks have shown us how easy it is for these individuals to use social networks to transform themselves. And it shows how fast and effectively terrorist propaganda can spread online. That's why, as Europol rapporteur, together with the whole Parliament, want to ensure that we use the necessary legal basis to develop our efforts on this front. But I also think it's important to have ongoing investigation of the roots, causes of this phenomenon, so that we can take coherent action, and that swiftly above all. I support the necessary interoperability of information systems with proper guarantees for the police forces and the security forces. And as soon as it's possible, we must enhance the Schengen information system. We need to ensure that the programme to combat radicalisation is given all the resources it needs. In prisons, we need to identify where there are problems and help reintegrate prisoners. There has to be better cooperation amongst all the member states, particularly with Europol and Eurojust. We have to enhance social inclusion and hold up the values of the European Union. And so I welcome the Commission's proposal that Erasmus Plus be used together with Youth Fora for intercultural dialogues. Lastly, the European Union and all its member states must strengthen, improve the whole arsenal of tools available to them to prevent and fight any form of radicalisation. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci, chers collègues. 2 minutes 30 pour...
Thank you. 2.5 minutes for Mr. Pascu.
If 9/11/2001 has been the work of teams of Al-Qaeda operatives sent to the United States, today most acts of terrorism are the result of radicalized nationals who one day decide to kill as many people around them as possible. Why and how do they get radicalized, and even more important, how can we prevent that radicalization? However, let us not forget that radicalization is not coming out of the blue. Usually it is the result of an increasing pressure exercised through siren calls and propaganda, instigating hate and praising mass killing as pressure release, using in most cases the relative anonymity of the net. Some people, usually from outside our countries, are doing that, and we have, apart from countering their narrative, even discrediting it, to find those people and deal with them according to our laws. Because to let those people get radicalized, not interfering with that, concentrating our efforts in preventing them to commit the horrible crimes they are convinced to do, is not enough. Sooner or later they will find a way. But if we actively engage in dismantling those sources of radicalization, both in mosques and on the net, in cooperation with the Muslim communities themselves, and engage in active countering of their narratives of hate for a long period to come, then we stand a chance to do away with this phenomenon. After all, some years ago, a notorious author of espionage books, Tom Clancy, if I'm not mistaken, has described exactly such a case, when a recruiter of jihadists was discredited in the eyes of his followers, ending being captured. His imaginary plot has become reality today. Why not his recipe? Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Sulik.
Thank you, Mr. Sulik. 1 minute.
Europäische Kommission nimmt offenbar an,
the Commission seems to be assuming that terrorists would pass the mental health test and get the certificate for acquiring firearms from the police and then proceed with a terrorist attack. This is why the Commission has suggested that illegal possession of a firearm should be massively reduced, saying that fighting against terrorism means that we have to strip honest people of their freedoms. And then the ladies and gentlemen in the Commission will know that the EU has less and less people who support it. Commissioner Bieńkowska even claims that the EU needs to do this because every year hundreds of thousands of people are killed using legally acquired weapons. That is not true. The actual figure is approximately 1,500 for the whole of Europe. I therefore called upon the Commission to take this fairy tale of this directive and to withdraw it entirely, because it's not going to help one bit in the fight against terrorism. Thank you.
Monsieur Coelho.
Mr. Coelho, 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Minister, Commissioner, I compliment the Commission on the document it tabled last week on the prevention of radicalisation, which thus responded to an appeal from this House. This communication makes it clear that radicalisation does not flow just from a single factor. It's a complex phenomenon which even further elements have been added to by the information society. In tackling this, we have to see the whole picture. In other words, looking at prevention, punishment and reintegration. But we also need to involve a range of across-the-board measures in a number of fields, and they will be all the more effective if they are closer to our citizens, whether it be in the regions, the local municipalities, schools or community centres. In that context, prisons play a crucial role. We don't want prisons to become either universities of crime or new centres for radicalisation. We know that these are very much national prerogatives, but the Union must support measures geared towards prevention within the prison system and more successful reintegration of released prisoners. And the Union must support long-term policies, particularly in education. Clearly, radicalisation leading to violent fundamentalism has to be punished, The guilty must be made to shoulder their responsibilities, and we have to thwart potential instigators. The proposed amendment of the Schengen Information System 2 at the end of this year should bring in a range of improvements which will allow the SIS to carry out more concerted and effective action in the member states in prevention and punishment. Then on reintegration, whether we're talking about children exposed to a radical environment or adults who have been found guilty of offences, we have to work harder on reintegration, and the Parliament and Commission have to work together. That's why in the 2016 budget I've made proposals on de-radicalising children.
A blue card for you. Do you accept it? Yes, you do, Mr. Szanyi.
Tibor.
Tibor?
Push the button.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, elnök asszony. Tisztelt képviselő úr, nem lesz abban.
Now, colleagues, now we agree that we need a common European approach. We need a way to work to consider it, and of course education plays a very important role with regard to this entire issue, and that's why I would like to ask the following. When will the moment come for you, for the EPP, that is to say, that you, that this particular propaganda, this horrific propaganda that is being exercised by the Orban government, when will you go against that finally? Thank you.
Sr. Presidente, falando em termos pessoais e...
Madam President, putting this in personal terms, talking about the EPP, we never confuse immigration and terrorism. On the contrary, we want to make it clear that our response to migration has to be on two fronts. We have to tackle problems at the origin of the flows and then deal with the humanitarian problem. So that there's no other way forward.
Piotrowski, 1 minute.
Mr. Piotrowski, 1 minute.
President, thank you very much. The Commission's communication recently published on prevention of radicalization leading to extremism combined with violence. This communication includes a lot of recommendations. Stressed is education. Children should be brought up in the spirit of diversity. Teachers should be tasked with detecting first signs of radicalization among their pupils. Children should be taught common values, but this is not expressed precisely enough. The Commission does see a connection between radicalization and terrorist attacks, but the Commission has failed to say such attacks are being committed by Islamic radicalists. The Commission should present a better diagnosis, do away with political correctness and go back to the roots of Europe, which is Christian values. Thank you.
Monsieur ZVER.
Mr. ZVER, 2 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom is the most valued freedom in the European Union, something worth protection. Furthermore, there's another value of extreme importance for Europeans. Europeans have been living for centuries already in peace. Well, I'm talking about the need for security and the need to feel safe. And citizens feel increasingly threatened. Our safety is at threat due to a number of factors. The uncertainty with the refugees, radicalization, wars being waged, and terrorism is threatening us the most. Not just imported terrorism, but also homegrown terrorism. Europe is under threat. Therefore, what Europe needs is a new coherent strategic strategy in order to unleash the security potential. And we need more budgetary means to be allocated in all member states. It's not just a matter of creating the structures, but also high quality training and education and investments in order to better integrate young people. I would congratulate Mr. Navracsics for having come forward with a series of very specific measures to do these things. Now it is up to the member states to act. In the field of security, the EU can show it can work effectively if we can crush the terrorist networks. There are hundreds of them, and in the EU, terrorist propaganda needs to be silenced. And of course, this will be assisted if we can be effective at closing the external borders and ensure that European societies will flourish. Radicalization needs to be fought in prisons, and it is high time for Europeans to make a greater contribution towards security.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished colleagues. Actually, fighting against radicalization is not so complex, but the fight will not be successful if we only rely on empty words. In order to have radicalization, you have someone who needs to pay for it. Who is paying for radicalization? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey. These are the countries where you find fundamental Islam. These are the countries who pay for radicalization. And who are the people who are radicalized? It's people who actually reached Europe in one way or another and who are told there, you're so precious as you are. Just stay different, stick to your own values. And this is a mistake. They should be told, if you want to come to Germany, please behave like Germans do. If you want to go to Poland, behave as the Polish do. Everything else is empty words and hypocrisy. Thank you.
JIMÉNEZ-BECERRIL pour 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Sí, de nuevo, muchas gracias.
Well, once again, I'd like to thank you very much, President. The moments of silence, the anger, the candles, the mourning, all of these are, this is the way that we pay homage to victims. Yesterday, it was the young people in Orlando. Thereafter, it was the couple, the police couple from France. To everybody, I would like to express a thanks to these individuals for granting us, for allowing us to live somehow in peace and freedom. They have fought for that. So we have to really defend our form of life. We have to realize that the only way to get through all this is to win this war against terrorism. We have to draw up measures in order to fight radicalization, to fight terrorism. We have to do this in a concerted fashion. The EPP has put terrorism and the fight against it, set it as one of its priorities. It is only thus, through prevention, that we will be able to move forward. Security measures are important, the exchange of information, and using all means in our tool chest, every implement that we have in order to fight terrorism before terrorism defeats us. With regard to internet, that which brings together the people of ISIS, we have to have proper surveillance. We have to work in prisons as well. But we need unity. We need political unity in order to effectively fight terrorism. We need will. This will that comes together immediately after an attack. It has to live on. There has to be a way of fighting together concertedly, within our borders and outside of our borders as well. What I've been asking for 7 years is a directive, European directive for victims of terrorism, because these victims are killed in order to intimidate society as a whole. We must defend these victims. Thank you.
2 minutes également.
2 minutes for Mr. Zdechovský as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, radicalization, just like terrorism or extremism, knows no borders. All these three phenomena that I have just mentioned are a great and unpredictable threat to us. In fighting them, the European Union plays an important role, and I dare say a very special role, which is more important than ever before. The task of the European agencies must be to interconnect the member states and their administration and the information that they have, which was not the case in the Paris or Brussels attacks. which didn't work. And not only within the EU, but in cooperation with third countries as well. Let's unite, let's cooperate with African countries, let's cooperate with Turkey, let's cooperate with other countries in the fight against radicalization, extremism and violence. The fight against radicalization as such is not that easy. I think that the primary cause is the failed integration, long-term frustration and the total loss of European values. It is therefore very important to address these causes and thus prevent a further spread of radicalization. We have to talk to young people. As my colleagues from the EPP have said, we have a plan. And the EPP wants to apply its strategy that it has adopted a short time ago on one of its meetings. If the European Union fails in its role, then we will witness events similar to those of the last months, and we will never be able to keep radicalization, terrorism and extremism at bay. Therefore, I call for cooperation. That's all there is to it. That's the key to success in the fight against radicalization.
Mr. Brok for 2 minutes.
Monsieur Brok.
Frau Präsidentin.
Chairman, President rather, Commissioner, Vice President. Having listened to the Commission statement, well, I think that we have to work in situ, in schools. Of course, that's of a decisive nature, but we have to also work internationally to fight against radicalization of any sort. Take this opportunity to say that this is a challenge for all of us, and we have to provide a proper example. We heard from about the right and labeling people as trash and garbage. But this is just the beginning of radicalization. You force people, you push people into radicalization by demeaning them or by acting in a condescending fashion in the first place. So the freedom of thought, the simply not discriminating against people is an example that we ought to set for others. And this has to become part of our political narrative. And it is, we have to understand the nature of this particular challenge. And we're in a position to really fight against terrorism in an effective fashion, we will then have achieved in opening ourselves up to understanding and to responding to the various demands that exist. Between people, this kind of generalization that other people are no good or lazy or dividing people up into different categories through generalizations. Unfortunately, this feeds into radicalization in our own society, and radicalization which involves states, countries, individuals, ethnic groups. And I think we have to really take into consideration some of the examples that have been given in the debate, what we have to do, in other words, in order to avoid radicalization and simply understand the gravity of this particular challenge. Thank you.
Now, catch the eye procedure with 6 requests. Mrs. Schroeder to begin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Colleagues, Commissioner, radicalization, violence are nothing new. What is new is the frequency of incidents and the brutality, and the fact that it is being committed by people who grew up in EU countries where we raise our children in respect of our values. The reasons, as it's been said, is frustration of young people who have no perspective and thus easily fall victim to propaganda. As the Commissioner proposed, we need to strengthen our society, yes, but we need tools for that. The Internet Security Fund, work in prisons, etc., etc., etc. Tools on the EU and the national levels. But I think that the key is to strengthen our personal and social development. We need to improve the self-awareness of young people. In imbue them with positive values. And I'm sure that the Commissioner understands these values and why it's important to support them. Thank you.
Monsieur Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Presidente, gli attentati di...
Thank you, Madam President. The latest terrorist attacks show how vulnerable European citizens are to terrorist groups and how important it is to prevent phenomena of radicalization. It's a problem of what are often young people who have broken away from society and pose a threat to security in Europe and neighbouring countries. In order to defend ourselves from this phenomenon, we need more than repression. We need effective preventive measures. We need to strengthen interfaith dialogue with all religious communities and ensure that the member states all work together. Of course, we have to dismantle terrorist networks and stay off the financial flows that feed them. We can only fight radicalization if at the same time we have a program for social integration. Thank you.
Marias, 1 minute également.
Marias, 1 minute as well.
Thank you very much, Chair President. The causes of radicalization are political and economic and social. First of all, it has been strengthened by the interventions of the West in the Middle East and also the role of Turkey in the Gulf as well and the funding through channels of Turkey and the Gulf. All of this has fed into jihadism. And, of course, when we fight against radicalization, we have to look at this. At the same time as we're trying to fight radicalization, we're talking about stopping the visa regime that's in place for Kosovo. This is a breeding ground for radicalism. There is radicalization there. According to the local police in Kosovo, over 300 Kosovos have been involved in various terrorist activities, in bomb making and so forth. Now, in the Commission, you have been adopting kind of paradoxical policies. On the one hand, you say you're going to fight terrorism. On the other hand, you're opening the door to Kosovo jihadists. Look at this seriously, because it is a grave matter.
Monsieur Jakovčić.
Mr. Jakovčić.
Merci beaucoup.
The series of terrorist attacks is terrifying. We can list many cities in the Western world. We can list such incidents in many other countries and states in the Middle East and elsewhere. However, I would like to turn the story upside down. We need information. We need to prevent horrors on the internet. This is a repressive action, but thousands of brilliant examples of tolerance of people who live with immigrants, who have received them, who faith communities who live together, linguistic communities who live together. There are fantastic examples. Let us show them. Let us show what European policies can do.
1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. The Paris and Brussels attacks were proof of the fact that your Europe has failed. Your blind ideology, the European Union, Mr. Brok, has become a sieve. Measures must be taken. They are fairly straightforward. Shut down the borders, re-establish border checks. Security, Mr. Brok, is the first of freedoms. Thank you.
Monsieur SYNADINOS.
And Mr. SYNADINOS, to finish, 1 minute.
President, before we try to solve the issue of terrorism and radicalization in Europe, let's look at what's going on at home. There are members of parliament who have been forbidden from participating in public activities. They have been incarcerated. They have been blocked from voting. There are certain members of parliament as well who have been blocked altogether from any sort of political activity. Isn't this an infringement, a violation of democracy? At the same time, you're trying to destroy nationalist movements which love their countries and fight for them. And you are at the same time trying to keep in power parties of the establishment, and this simply undermines stability altogether. This has to come to an end. Let us not forget that there are colleagues here who fight for their countries, who have been defending the dignity of their countries, and they themselves have been accused of terrorists, whereas the terrorists seem to be elsewhere. Thank you.
This brings us to the end of the Catch the Eye procedure. Back to the Commissioner, Mr. Navracsics.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me first thank you, the honourable members of the European Parliament, for that interesting and very constructive debate. It was good to feel your unanimous support for the communication. I would say almost all elements of the communication, and it was good to feel your support for the security policy measures. But I would like to emphasize now my particular happiness of your support in prevention, because education is the most efficient area and platform in prevention. We can educate good practices, good examples for peaceful coexistence, just as Mr. Jakovčić mentioned. We can show our power and the community's power, and we can concentrate on the local specialties in education as well, because I think the local level is decisive in prevention. That's why we support role models. That's why we support NGOs and local projects. And that's why we support reintegration and integration projects in prisons, for instance. We have very good plans for developing new programs in education, in vocational education, in prisons and outside the prisons, in local communities, in schools and beyond schools, in sports clubs, youth centers, and all other platforms where young people live and where they are socialized. So thank you for your support. I rely on you in the further works, and I hope that we will be successful in tackling radicalization in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Koenders, on behalf of the Council.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And thank you, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, for a very constructive and interesting debate. Let me just repeat that I'm grateful for the Parliament's support and for your contribution. I think we share the same objectives in our common fight against radicalisation and violent extremism. We must live up to the expectations of our citizens to improve their safety. Fighting terrorism, preventing radicalisation and increasing the resilience of our societies requires a long-term approach, strong commitment and a sustained effort from the European Union and its member states. So it is something that we have to do every day. It is work in progress, but we have no time to lose, because our enemies are very quickly, if we don't watch out, in front of us. That means we have to be innovative. I've heard many contributions on the different levels of the debate, both in the analysis as in the prescriptions. In the analysis, most of you have mentioned both social as well as religious and criminal sources for this process of radicalization. And I think you're right. It is a multifaceted problem of which you have different characteristics, and we have to make sure that we have tailor-made prevention and repressive measures to deal with this very complex issue. We cannot wait. The paper is always very patient, but we need to act, and I feel very much the support in this Parliament for these actions taken by the Council and others. We simply cannot allow those who want to hurt our system or our way of living to win. In the end, democratic societies will always win from terror and extremists. It is in the end believing in your values and defending them. What terrorists want is in the end to instill fear by violence. And our vulnerability to that fear is the determining factor. And I think that is something that we have to realize every day we are dealing with this issue. With every step we take, every measure we adopt, it is important that we strike the right balance between security on the one hand and protecting our freedoms and the rule of law on the other. That's sometimes a precarious balance, but I think we kept our values straight, including the rule of law, while being effective in the struggle against radicalization. We must be strong and continue to repeat that same message over and over again. Our basic freedoms will not be compromised by terrorism nor by individuals with guns. The Council is determined to reach tangible results in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much once again for your attention, Madam President.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of that debate. From this S&D group, I've received a request for Mr. Pedro Silva Pereira to be designated on behalf of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Are there any comments? Apparently not. That nomination is approved. We can now move on to the declaration of the Commission on the multi-annual plan for cod, herring and sprat stocks in the Baltic and the fisheries, fishing those stocks. I'll hand over to Mrs. Bieńkowska on behalf of the Commission.
Thank you very much, Madam President, honourable members. On behalf of the European Commission and, of course, Commissioner Carmenu Vella, who is responsible for the file in the College, I would like to thank the Rapporteur, Shadow Rapporteur and the Committee on Fisheries for all the hard work they have done to enable agreement to be reached for the multi-annual plan for the management of the stock of cod, herring and sprout and the fisheries in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Plan is the first of its kind, a landmark. It is the first of a new generation of multi-annual plans. These are important tools for the further implementation of our reformed common fisheries policy and for implementing its most ambitious element, the obligation to end wasteful discarding of fish and land all catches. In addition, these multi-annual plans provide an important framework for the development of more decentralized way of fisheries management, what we call regionalization. With regionalization in mind, I would also like to take the opportunity to state formally our declaration in relation to regional cooperation. When proposing and adopting delegated acts under the regionalization provisions of this plan, the Commission will comply with the framework set out in the basic regulation, in particular Article 18, and the practice established under the basic regulation in implementing the regionalization process will continue as it has since 2014. The Baltic Plan is the culmination of a process that has involved many players working together to reach consensus across many interests of involved parties. This process has included the Baltic fishing industry and the fishery ministers of concerned countries, as well as the legislators, of course, and the interests. The outcome is a balanced regulation that has incorporated the key concerns raised throughout the process. The agreement of both legislators has provided the blueprint for this new generation of multi-annual plans. This is very important for other marine regions for which the development of these plans will allow for sustainable long-term management. I will look forward to cooperate with you as we present the next set of proposals for further fisheries management plans for your careful consideration. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now Mr. Van Wenster has 2 minutes to open the debate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Commissioner. This first fisheries management plan under the new CFP was hard fought and is a result of very difficult, long negotiations where European Parliament had to make many concessions. We did it with the trust that included provisions will be enough to uphold sustainable fisheries in the Baltic Sea. This new plan must be put into action as soon as possible for setting tax and quotas for the year 2017. It is crucial that the EU institutions act responsibly and show now that the commitment to the principles are still alive. The European Parliament showed its commitment to sustainable fishing in the EU and the future for industry, and I must ask the Commission and the Council for the same. That's why I have two questions. Will the proposals from the Commission for the next year's total allowable catch in the Baltic be based on the scientific advice and the rules established in this new management plan? Is there any scenario where this new management plan and the rules within this plan to set total catches could not be used? It is crucial to use the new rules immediately, as the scientific advice regarding the western cod stock is very alarming. The stock has been under too much stress for a very long time, and so far the Council has failed to follow the scientific advice. The results of this failure have now led to an advice from the scientists to more or less close this fishery. Luckily, the new Baltic management plan has some new rules in place and safeguards to deal with such situations. After 10 months of difficult negotiations with the Council and the European Commission, these negotiations gave us a plan that upholds